Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Research Done Right with your host, Wonder Woman. Today we have lesson 9, and in today's lesson we're going to be talking about conducting experiments. So up until this point, we learned a lot about the difference between qualitative research and quantitative research. We spoke a lot about ethics in previous episodes. So now this lesson is mainly geared to give you some best practices and tips when it comes to you conducting your own experiments. So on our agenda today, the first thing we'll talk about are manipulations of the independent variable. So basically, we know that the independent variable is the variable that the experimenter or the researcher has the power to manipulate. Typically, this is known as the treatment effect, and this is the various dosages, exposures, stimuli, basically differences in degrees of that exposure to the different groups. We have the experimental group and we have the control group at minimum. But there are certain independent variables that the researcher cannot control and cannot manipulate. And so that is what we will start learning about in manipulations of the independent variable. The second thing we'll talk about are the 3 different types of dependent variables and different measurements and ways that we can measure our dependent variables. So in our previous episode, we did speak specifically about surveys, right? Self-report dependent variable measurements, but there are 2 other ones, including behavioral measures and physiological measures. So we'll see how those compare and contrast. Then we'll talk about the ceiling versus the floor effects, basically 2 things that you want to avoid when you conduct your own experiments. We'll also talk about the importance of participant and experimenter expectations. In terms of expectations, we briefly touched on the social desirability effect, which means that participants tend to behave in unnatural ways when they know they're being observed or evaluated. But we also have specific expectations that can happen on the part of the experimenter, right? Some bias that we introduce into our own experiments. And the last thing we'll do is we'll wrap up the discussion by talking about pilot studies and why they're extremely important before you start conducting your research experiment on a larger group of people. So let's talk about the manipulations of the independent variable. So there are 2 different types of manipulations. The first one is called the straightforward manipulation, in which we present written, verbal, or visual material to participants. Straightforward manipulations often use instructions that accompany these different stimulus presentations. For example, if you're testing someone's memory by asking them how many words they can recall after reading a list of words, we can also see how people respond or react to different social norm signs in social settings. Even when it comes to surveys or ratings of particular effectiveness, your pleasure, your satisfaction with something, all of those are really straightforward manipulations because the participants are exposed to a stimulus and then we measure some type of behavior or attitude or belief, etc., based on the stimuli that they saw. So it's very direct and it's very clear. The other type of manipulation we have is a staged manipulation. So when you think of the word stage, you might think of an actor or a performance. And that's actually what this is. So staged manipulations often involve deception. And the reason we use stage manipulations is to create a particular psychological state in our participants. This could be anger, stress, temporary low self-esteem. But of course, all within the realms of ethics, right? So we don't want to repeat the Milgram study. We don't want to repeat the Stanford, prison study. So none of those things, because those are obviously unethical. But in certain situations in which we want to study social psychology, specifically things like conformity, we may use things like deception. And the whole point of this is to simulate a situation that may occur in the real world. And similar to a performance or a movie or a stage, actors are involved, and the scientific term for these actors is confederates. So a confederate is a person who appears to be part of the experiment, but actually is part of the manipulation. So if you think back to Milgram's obedience to authority study, when we talked about the electric shocks that were administered, When the participants arrived at the experimenting site, they were not aware that the person behind the screen, the student, the learner who was receiving the shocks, was actually a Confederate and was actually told to scream and express pain and things like that. So in those situations, because that had a negative effect on the participants, it psychologically traumatized them. And of course, when we talk about Zimbardo's prison study, we saw something very similar. So again, within the realms of ethics, we do try to simulate situations to symbolize conformity. So what is conformity? So basically it's conforming, right? Assimilating, agreeing with the majority, even though your personal beliefs don't necessarily align with those. So for example, there's a test known as the Asch line test, in which an image is shown, like a standard line, and then 3 other options are shown beside it, and you're supposed to choose which line is closest to the first standard line that you were shown. And so in a conformity study, you would purposely have other people in the room give the wrong answer. And so ultimately what starts to happen is that the participant, the real participant, right, not the Confederate, starts to become affected, right? Their attitudes, their beliefs start to change. And it's like, if everyone else is seeing it this one way, even though you personally are not, you eventually conform to what the majority's opinion or belief is. And so again, that is a situation in which we need to stage that manipulation. Because you can imagine if you actually told the participant, hey, you know, we're going to have a bunch of actors that are going to fake the answer just to see if you will agree with them or not, that would defy the whole point of the study. So that's why in certain situations, when you do need to simulate something like that and you can't actually tell them the real reason of the study, we do use deception. Of course, you should remember that when you are using deception, it is your responsibility as the researcher to in the debriefing stage to admit to the participants exactly what was going on and why you did it that way. So using stage manipulations can decrease external validity, mainly because external validity is related to generalization, and it's going to be hard to generalize to a population that didn't experience these particular Confederates, that didn't experience this specific simulation. So stage manipulations do decrease external validity, and they may also lead to alternative explanations. So now let's talk about the different types of dependent variables. We have 3 main types of dependent variables. These include self-report measures, behavioral measures, and physiological measures. So let's talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. Self-report measures, right, basically involve the participants answering the questions. So you as the researcher have no control over what the participants are saying. You also have no control to determine whether they're telling the truth or not. So basically, self-report measures are used to measure people's attitudes, whether they like someone or something, particular judgments about personality characteristics, right? Like, do you agree or disagree on a scale of 1 to 5? How often do you do X, Y, Z? And they're also used to measure emotional states. So anytime you want to give a participant some type of a mood assessment or a satisfaction survey, that would definitely be a self-report measure, because you as a researcher don't know, you would need them to provide that information to you. The second type of dependent variable measure we have is a behavioral measure. Behavioral measures are more objective, and this is when the researcher is actually doing the measures and collecting the measurements. So these are things like direct observation of behaviors. So rate is a great example of a behavioral measure. So you might be watching participants complete a particular task, and you want to see how often or how quickly they are performing a particular task. Let's say you ask them to solve a crossword puzzle, but what you're really interested in is how many times they look to the right side of the screen, right? So you might be counting how many times they leave the task at hand and look somewhere else. Duration, right? The amount of time it takes someone to complete a task. That's another behavioral measure. Oftentimes in cognition, we're interested to see how long it will take participants to react to a certain stimulus. And for example, when we talk about research around drugs and we want to see how that affects the reaction time, whether participants become more slow or more fast in terms of reacting to a certain stimulus. Reaction time, right, the amount of time in minutes or seconds, what have you, is going to be that behavioral measure. So you could see how all of these things, because they're quantifiable and they're measurable by certain devices, they also are considered to be more objective than a self-report measure. Other behavioral measures can involve counting the number of errors someone made when completing a certain task, or again, the number of times a specific behavior occurs. Typically, these behavioral measures indicate the choice or the intention of the participant. So again, if you think back to prior to the cognitive revolution, right, in the early 1900s, when cognition was popular, right before behaviorism intervened, the question, or I guess the concern, was always that we can't see people's thoughts. So what we can see is their behaviors. So that's why, based on their behaviors, we are able to imply the thoughts of the participants and their intention and their decisions and their choices based on the behaviors they're making. And so that's why behavioral measures are really important and a really objective way to collect data during your experiment. The third type of measure we have are physiological responses, or physiological measures, which indicate bodily responses. So one of the methods we use is a galvanic skin response. Basically, these are used to measure emotional arousal and anxiety. Basically, there is an increase of electricity on the skin when the body starts to sweat. And we know that typically when we sweat, we often feel anxious or aroused for some particular reason. So that is an example of a physiological measure. EMGs help you measure muscle tension, and typically when muscles are tense, that indicates a particular emotional response. And we also have EEGs in which, given a variety of different connections to your scalp and to your head, and really advanced technology, we can actually measure electrical activity in a person's brain. So it's true that physiological measures are also objective. They're also very helpful because we can also quantify them and measure them and analyze them statistically. But if you are looking to conduct an experiment at your own university or high school or college, it's kind of unlikely that your department will have all of these really advanced, expensive technological measurements. So it's okay if your experiment won't be using a physiological measure. It's just for you to know that that is a third type of measure of the dependent variable. So now let's talk about ceiling versus floor effects. When you think about the word ceiling, you probably think of something at the top. And when you think about the floor, you probably think of something at the bottom. So ceiling and floor effects are related to the sensitivity of the dependent variable. So what do I mean by that? When you are measuring the dependent variable, you want to make sure that it is sensitive enough to detect differences between the groups. So for example, if you're trying to collect information on a person's attitude or beliefs using some self-report measure, and you use only yes and no questions, using only a binary response option kind of forces the participant to choose between yes or no, but maybe they feel neutral, or in some instances, maybe instead of yes and no, they want to actually say maybe. So that's different than having something on a rating scale from 1 to 5. With a rating scale, participants have more options to choose from. So we also talked about not having even numbers when we have a rating scale. And the reason behind this is if you have even numbers, then it will skew either positive or negative. But again, participants don't have that option to report feeling neutral. So typically having an odd number of anchors or option choices allows the participant to give that answer. And so all of these things are important when you're collecting your data or measuring your dependent variable. Again, you want to make sure that your data is collected accurately and truly represents what the participants are thinking or feeling. So sometimes a task may be really easy, right? Maybe too easy, and everyone will do it very well, regardless of their group assignment or condition. So we know that the independent variable, right, has a minimum of 2 levels. We have a control group and we have an experimental group. The control group is the group that gets a smaller level of the independent variable or doesn't get the exposure to the treatment at all. And then the experimental group is the one that does receive the larger dose or the level in question. And imagine that you are measuring the difference among these two groups based on your dependent variable. If your dependent variable is too similar, or it's too simple, or it's not going to show much of a difference between your two groups, it will lead you to conclude that your hypothesis was actually not true and that the groups don't differ in any way. So tasks have to vary in their difficulty to avoid what is known as the ceiling effect. The ceiling effect is when the independent variable appears to have no effect on the dependent variable because participants quickly reach the maximum level. For example, if as a teacher I was interested to see if the material for exam 2 was significantly harder than the material on exam 1. In that instance, it would mean that the questions I pose for exam 2 would have to be more difficult than the ones in exam 1. If the level of difficulty for both exam 1 and exam 2 are the same, even though the material in fact was harder, right? Because the level of difficulty of the questions I was asking are the same, then I'm probably going to end up with a conclusion of no difference between difficulty of material. In fact, the material was more difficult for exam 2, but because my assessment was too simple, I got a ceiling effect in which everyone across both conditions, exam 1 and exam 2, got really high scores. The opposite problem occurs with the floor effect when the task is so difficult that nobody can perform well, right? So for example, if I as a teacher have really high expectations, right? And even though the material on exam 1 was less difficult than the material on exam 2, but I made the test for exam 1 and exam 2 so difficult, I threw in a lot of trick questions, for example, then I would not see a difference between the groups either. So basically, the ceiling effect and the floor effect will yield in the decision to fail to reject your hypothesis, right? The groups will not have a difference when in fact I'm trying to prove that the differences exist. So recap, ceiling effect is when everyone does really well across all the conditions of the independent variable because the measure of the dependent variable was too simple. On the other hand, a floor effect occurs when everyone across the conditions does poorly because the measurement of the dependent variable was too difficult. And so obviously, these are things that you want to think through before you start conducting your own experiment. Measuring participants, gathering participants, all of that takes time and all of it is also expensive. So you want to make sure that you think through the difficulty levels so you avoid the ceiling and floor effects and so that you don't waste time and you don't waste money on purchasing equipment and paying, particular personnel to help you run these particular studies. Okay, now let's talk about expectations. So the first type of expectations we'll talk about are those on the behalf of the participants. You don't want participants to know exactly what you're measuring due to what is called demand characteristics. Basically, any feature of the experiment that can give away the true purpose of your study. Participants can start to form expectations about the study and try to confirm or prove your hypothesis, right? They're going to try to act in a way that they think you want them to act. Hence, it brings us to social desirability, reactivity, all of those things. So how do we solve for this? What's the solution to participant expectations? Well, one of them, as we talked about, is deception. So we're not saying necessarily lie to them. We're saying maybe disguise what you're truly looking for in a different way. So for example, if I was interested in learning the number of times a participant would scratch their nose in a 10-minute period, I wouldn't tell them that during the consent. I would ask them, to participate in a study in which they're going to be reading perhaps a narrative for 10 minutes, and then they're going to answer some questions based on what they read. I don't really care about their answer on these questions. What I'm interested in is observing and counting how many times they scratch their nose. But if I told them that, then they would either refrain from scratching their nose or perhaps scratch very frequently. So it is deception, but it's still ethical. And again, in the debriefing, that's when I would tell the participants the truth about what I was measuring. The other fascinating effect we can have is a placebo effect. So we know that there are two groups at minimum when we are interested in measuring some level of the independent variable. One group is the control group, one group is the experimental group. The experimental group will receive a particular dosage of treatment, and the control group, instead of not receiving anything, they also receive a type of treatment, but it actually doesn't have any dosage of the particular medication. They get something that simulates them receiving a dosage of a treatment, but in fact, they actually are receiving a sugar pill or something that looks like what the experimental group is getting, but in fact has a completely different dosage or no dosage at all of the independent variable. And so what happens is people, even in the placebo condition, the control group, they also start expressing or measuring in a different way on the dependent variable. And we start to see differences in the placebo control group that are similar to the differences in the experimental group. So basically, how is this happening? Was this effect actually due to the independent variable or to the participants' expectations about the effects of the independent variable? So basically, this underlying mechanism here is motivation and the power of our thoughts, the power of our cognitions. And so if you believe in something like that, if you believe that thoughts are powerful and can actually cause you to feel certain ways, then that's definitely something that we see with the placebo effect. So just because they think they're going to see a change in their behavior or see a change in how they're feeling, they in fact do. So it's actually driven by this motivation that's causing them to think that a change will happen when in fact it may not be due to the independent variable itself. Another thing you can do if you're using self-report measures, using a survey of some sort, you can also fill in the survey with distractor questions. So for example, if your main question of interest is one or two questions, but you can't give a participant a survey with only two questions because then it will be really obvious what it is that you're measuring, you can add filler questions or distractor questions in that questionnaire to deceive them and basically not have them realize the true question of your survey. If we talk about experimenter expectations, this is related to experimenter bias or expectancy effects. So the first thing to understand is bias is something that we don't want to have. We want to remove it. So why does it exist? Well, once you start conducting your own research, your own experiments, you will realize that you put a lot of thought and a lot of time into this, and maybe you are really adamant about the fact that your hypothesis is going to be proven true. You are so sure that you are going to see significant effects between your independent variable and your dependent variable. You are so rooting for the fact that you will have a significant correlation, etc., whatever analysis you choose to use. It's kind of like your child, right? Like if you've given birth to this amazing research project, it's a masterpiece. You really want it to be successful. You want it to do well. And so obviously things like that introduce bias. So typically, if the experimenter knows which condition participants are in, they may start to behave differently to kind of prime them or basically to help drive their effect, their significance. And so this isn't always intentional, right? This may cause them to unintentionally behave differently. Perhaps they start reading the instructions of the study differently. Perhaps they record the data differently, right? So for example, if I was interested to see whether a teacher who teaches with a comedic manner, right, someone who cracks a lot of jokes, versus a teacher who is very, very serious, right? If I wanted to test the efficacy of the teacher, and my dependent variable would be the amount of material students learn, right, given some assessment. So I have two levels. I have a funny teacher and I have a serious teacher. Those are my independent variables, right? Teaching style. My dependent variable is going to be the amount of information students learned. given their score on some assessment. If I know, right, which condition, and let's say my hypothesis, right, the hypothesis is very important. Let's say my hypothesis was that the teacher who's funny is actually going to be liked more by her students. And because she's liked more, the students will be more motivated to study, more motivated to attend class, and that's why their scores will be higher. That's not to say that the serious teacher was a bad teacher, absolutely not, but students were less motivated, perhaps they felt intimidated to come to class, so on and so forth, and the hypothesis is that the serious teacher will have lower scores on the assessment for learning. So if I know which condition the participants are in, the funny teacher or the serious teacher, and I want to prove the fact that the funny teacher is going to have higher scores, maybe I'll grade the assessments differently, right? Maybe if I am the same teacher being funny and I am the same teacher being serious, right? Because I'm more skewed and influenced by one of the levels, one of the conditions, it might cause me to behave differently across the two levels, right? And so that's bad because we want to have control. We want to have experimental control. And part of that control is on the part of the person conducting the experiment. So what do we do to mitigate this? Well, one of the solutions is to run all of the participants at the same time. Perhaps we have one time that all of the participants meet, and maybe the researcher or the teacher can implement both types of teaching styles. Maybe some of it is serious, some of it is funny, but basically kind of unify the groups so that the researcher or the teacher doesn't have to do the same thing twice, and that doesn't allow things to change if it's only done one time. Another way that we can do this is to automate certain procedures. So instead of reading the directions out loud to the participants or the students, they can be thrown up on a projector on a screen, right? Using a computer or some type of recording or some type of written instructions, right? A way in which the researcher doesn't interact with the participants at all. Another solution is to have a single blind study. In a single blind study, the participant is unaware of whether they're part of the control group or the experimental group. Now, in our case, we don't really have a control group. We have a serious teacher and we have a funny teacher. But basically, the participants don't know if they are in the funny group or the serious group, right? Everything is kind of anonymous. They could be called Group A and Group B, and the participants don't know which group they're in, A or B. A double-blind study is when neither the participant nor the researcher are aware of which group they are talking to, right? So they don't know if this is the control or placebo group or if they're talking to the experimental or treatment group. So oftentimes when you can't combine two sessions of trials or two experimental sessions, using a double-blind study eliminates the possibility for bias because neither the participant or the researcher know to which group they are speaking, and so they will most likely neutralize the way in which they give the instructions, record the data, etc. So the downside of this is that you do need to ask someone else to help you in terms of assigning and collecting the data. So for example, if you as the researcher are the person that is acting as the teacher and is being funny or is being serious, then somebody else needs to know which condition, which participants were in, right? You have to keep track of the data somehow, but you as the researcher are not the one doing it. So it is a double-blind study. So the last thing we'll talk about are pilot studies. Pilot studies are very helpful, especially when it comes to complex research designs. And basically a pilot study is a practice. It's a trial run of your experiment on a very small group of subjects. So you're not necessarily even going to keep this data. This is just a trial, a practice to make sure that everything goes smoothly. And basically it's good practice for you as a researcher to practice giving the instructions, time the amount of time it takes for the instructions to be given, how long the entire experiment takes, whether you're saying what you should be saying, whether you're staying neutral and not introducing bias. So basically pilot studies reveal whether participants even understand the instructions, right? Is the total experimental setting plausible and realistic, right? So Basically, this increases how many times you're able to conduct the experiment. If it is realistic, right, let's say you're collecting data on a snowy day in California, how often does that actually happen, right? So you want to make sure that the parameters of your, like the logistics of your experiment are actually realistic. You want to make sure that there aren't any confusing questions, right, in your assessments, whether it's something verbal, written, either way, you want to make sure that everything that the participants are hearing or seeing actually makes sense to them. You also want to make sure that the experiment is not too long, because we know that mortality happens in the sense that people drop out of your study if it is taking too long. And a really good thing to do at the end of your study is to basically ask, your little small sample of participants, open-ended questions, right? Like, how did you feel about this? How did you feel about the amount of time it took? Were you confused about anything? Basically, you're there to get feedback from these participants. Something really helpful that you could also do is a think aloud protocol. So basically, again, we can't hear or see what people are thinking, but we can definitely ask them to vocalize their thoughts. And so a think aloud protocol is a process in which your participants verbalize everything that they're thinking while they're participating in the experiment. So let's say you give them an instruction and they try to do it and they look confused. They will express to you at that moment in real time, oh, I didn't understand. What do you mean by this? I don't know where to find that, etc. So if participants can explain to you out loud while the experiment is happening, that's also really helpful for you as a researcher. So ultimately, pilot studies allow researchers to practice with a small group of people before conducting the same research project on a larger group of participants. And basically for a way for you to fix your mistakes before you spend all your time and all your money, on the larger scale of data collection. Okay, so as a recap in this lecture, we talked about manipulations of the independent variable, right? We talked about straightforward manipulations, which is typically the most common type of experiment. And we also talked about staged manipulations in which we use confederates and deception to measure mostly things related to social psychology, so we can simulate and recreate things and situations from our environment. We talked about the 3 different types of measures for dependent variables, right? So that was self-report, behavioral, and physiological measurements. We also talked about the importance of avoiding a ceiling or a floor effect, right? Making things too simple or making things too difficult, that no matter which condition the participants are in, they're either going to do too well or too poorly. We talked about the importance of expectations on both the participant and the researcher's point of view. So we want to make sure that we avoid any type of bias on the experimenter side. And we also want to make sure that the participants don't know too much about our study that will cause them to react in certain ways or act in socially desirable ways, which are not natural to what they were truly thinking or feeling. And last but not least, a good way to mitigate all of those previously mentioned items is to run a pilot study and make sure that everything in your experiment is going smoothly. It's always important to practice no matter what it is that you're doing, kind of before the final performance. So I definitely encourage all of you to practice your research projects before you administer them to larger groups of people. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time on Research Done Right.